Cold Case Explorations is a true crime video channel and podcast. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This video or podcast may contain content that is not suitable for all listeners. Viewer discretion is advised.
It was February 11th, 1979, when 5 local men decided to go for a fishing trip, departing from an isolated town called Hana on the Hawaiian island of Maui. By all accounts, it was the perfect day to go fishing, with the sun shining and very little wind. The fishermen were also practiced, with over 50 years of marine experience between the lot. What started out as a perfect day, however, quickly turned into a nightmare. Winds and rain picked up later in the day, resulting in the disappearance of all 5 men and an enduring mystery decades later. What happened to the fishermen of the Sarajevo? This is Cold Case Explorations podcast number 1, and as I briefly explained in the introduction, we're going to be talking about the disappearance of 5 men aboard the Sarajevo, a small fishing vessel that disappeared in February of 1979. Most of the men aboard were never found. One was, and as you'll find out, it only led to more questions about what really happened. So yeah, this is my first attempt at a video and a podcast. I've been writing articles for over a year now on my website, coldcaseexplorations.com, and wanted to try my hand at making some visual and audio media. So here we are. Let me know what you think. I've added captions because I know that a lot of video platforms don't have great closed captioning options, and I want everyone to be able to enjoy my videos. If you prefer reading, you can find all of my articles in their entirety for free on my website, coldcaseexplorations.com. With all that being said, come along with me, Cold Case Explorers, and let's learn about the disappearance of 5 men aboard the Sarajevo. In order to understand the story better, you need to know a little bit about Hana. You've probably heard about the road to Hana, but what about the town itself? Hana is a small town of approximately 1,500 people on the Hawaiian island of Maui. The community has always been tight-knit, and this was certainly true in the 1970s and 80s, when our case takes place. The only road into Hana for a long time was the Hana Highway, also known as the Road to Hana, making the town extremely isolated even from other towns and cities on Maui. The area surrounding Hana is one of the least developed places on the island, and many admire the lush, untamed landscapes that have been left largely untouched for centuries. Hana town today has a variety of modern structures like hotels and restaurants, but the town itself is still very isolated and hard to get to. As for the road to Hana, it's a twisting, turning, 64.4-mile road that's rough on cars. Many rental car agreements prohibit driving this path due to potential damage. That being said, if you're able to drive the road to Hana, it's definitely worth taking the trip to see the majestic landscapes and numerous waterfalls along the way. Because Hana is so isolated, the community there is understandably very close. Everyone in the town either knew one of the victims or knew of the victims, and they want answers too. Michael Wessner, the brother of missing crewmate Patrick Wessner, explained, quote, "It's all speculation. Everyone has their own thoughts on it. The thing is that they didn't come back. They're gone." Even decades later, the mystery of the Sarajevo lives on and is often discussed in the community, especially by those family members who still don't have all the answers. Let's dive into what happened. February 11th, 1979 appeared to be a perfect day to get some fishing in for the 5 friends. Benjamin Kalama, 38, Peter Hanchett, 31, Scott Mormon, 27, Ralph Maliachini, 27, and Patrick Wessner, 26, left the harbor around 10 a.m. It was said to be a calm, clear day, a perfect time to get some fishing in. The men all lived in or near Hana and had gotten to know one another through the local community, either through work or recreation. Mormon and Wessner played on a local softball team for the Hana League, one of their favorite pastimes. Hanchett was the only licensed plumber at the time in Hana, along with being a fisherman and wild pink hunter. Kalama was a tile layer and mason who had 5 children, and Maliachini was a professional fisherman. The group was on Maliachini's 17-foot Boston whaler, which is a type of boat, called the Sarajevo, so named after his mother, Sarah, and his father, Joe. Even though Maliachini was the only professional fisherman, and thus very experienced on the water, all were experienced marine men in their own right. When the group headed out, there was nothing to be worried about. The weather was perfect. It's been reported that the group was aiming to catch some giant jack crevalle, known locally as alua. These massive predatory fish can weigh nearly 300 pounds and put up the fight of a lifetime, according to many anglers. The big catch would be a boon for the anglers as they could sell their catch or distribute the meat among friends or family. The group headed for the Alanuihaha Channel, a 30-mile wide swathe of water between Maui and the Big Island. These waters can be some of the roughest near the islands, but the crew of the Sarajevo would have known that and were experienced enough to be careful. It wasn't until later in the day when the winds changed direction that there was any hint of trouble. An island breeze turned into a gusting gale, and those who knew that the friends were out fishing were instantly concerned about them. Peter Hanchett's father, John Hanchett, grew concerned, saying, quote, "I told Dave we better get down to the coast to see if we could spot those boys and wave them in," unquote. It started raining and blowing hard, and despite the awful weather, Hanchett went out on his own boat to go look for the missing Sarah Joe. He found no sign of the boat or the missing men and was soon forced back to shore, lest he end up in real trouble as well. While other vessels somehow managed to make it back to shore, the Sarah Joe never did. People waited by the shoreline, hoping and praying that the smaller boat would come trudging in eventually. However, neither the boat nor her passengers ever came back. The boat was reported missing late in the afternoon after failing to return to shore. John Hanchett continued to search for the Sarah Joe, grabbing a marine biologist named John Naughton on the day after the disappearance to help in the search. They still found nothing, and on the third day, Hanchett recruited Coast Guard Captain Jim Cushman to assist as well. Despite all their efforts, they found no signs of the men or of the missing boat. For about a week, helicopters, boats, and volunteers combed the areas surrounding Hana to look for any sign of the Sarah Joe. They were hoping to find some debris or clothing, anything that would hint at what had happened to the small fishing vessel. Eventually, an area of 73,000 miles had been searched, and still there was no trace of the Sarah Joe. After so much effort and nothing to show for it, the search was suspended. Even so, residents of Hana continued to look for debris along the beaches, hoping that something would turn up and shed light on what had happened. Some residents on the Big Island also heard about the disappearance and combed the beaches near the Alanuihaha Channel in case anything washed up. Nothing did. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, and still nothing of the Sarah Joe was ever found. Families of the fishermen waited a whole year after the boat's disappearance to hold any sort of memorial for them. They were still hanging on to hope that one day they'd have an answer for what happened to the Sarah Joe and their loved ones. They'd have to wait a while longer. Although the families of the missing men never gave up hope of learning what had happened on February 11th, 1979, they also understood that it was highly unlikely that any of the men were still alive. Despite extensive searches by authorities and the public, no sign of the boat or the crew was found. That is, until 1988. In September 1988, a research team was studying some areas of the Tonga Atoll located in the northern Marshall Islands. This atoll is about 2,300 miles from the Hawaiian Islands, which makes it slightly further away than Hawaii is from the mainland United States. The Tonga Atoll is the first speck of land in the southwestern direction from Hawaii, and the area is uninhabited due to low rainfall and poor fishing conditions, making life there very difficult. Marine biologist John Naughton was conducting some research on the atoll, namely in search of sea turtles and nesting birds. He was on Sibylla Island when he spotted something that was out of place, a boat that was washed ashore. You may recall that Naughton was one of the men who had initially helped in the search for the missing Sarah Joe back in 1979. Now, over a decade later, he was at the Tonga Atoll trying to conduct research on wildlife when he encountered the banged-up boat. Curiously, Naughton approached the boat and recognized that it had to have been from Hawaii due to the registration number. He continued his inspection and saw some letters still emblazoned on the hull, with S, A, H, and J still legible. It could only be the Sarah Joe. As the initial excitement of finding the Sarah Joe faded, the question now was what happened to her crew. There had been 5 men aboard, after all, so where were they? Leading a search of the island, Naughton and the other researchers unfortunately located a crudely dug grave site with a cross marking it. Near the boat site, litter was located that had originated from Hawaii, confirming that the southwestern currents had carried the Sarah Joe all the way from the Hawaiian Islands to the Tonga Atoll, a journey of over 2,300 miles. Beneath the driftwood cross and in the grave was a body, likely one of the men aboard the Sarah Joe. But who was it, and who buried him? No one else was found on Sibylla Island, dead or alive, and it appeared that the body had been there for some time. Naughton alerted the Coast Guard, who came and retrieved the remains, then brought them to the U.S. Army Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii. The body was confirmed to be that of Scott Mormon, one of the men who'd been on the Sarah Joe when she vanished. Memorials were held both in Hana and in California, where Mormon was originally from. The discovery also rekindled the idea that the remains of the other crewmen might be out there somewhere too. But who had buried Mormon? Because of the remoteness and the inhospitable nature of the Tonga Atoll, it's believed that Mormon's remains were discovered by illegal fishermen who then buried him. Paper and thin tinfoil was also reported to be found in the grave. It's thought that the papers and foil were placed there to follow a local custom for respect for the dead. The prevailing theory is that a Taiwanese fishing boat found Mormon's remains and buried them, but didn't report the discovery to authorities because they were fishing illegally in Marshall Island waters. In order to avoid legal trouble, they just buried the body, placed the papers in tinfoil, and moved on. Some claim that the missing Sarah Joe incident isn't mysterious at all. Clearly, the boat got swept up in a storm, the men either succumbed to the elements or drowned, and the Sarah Joe ended up beached on the Tonga Atoll sometime later. And that might have been the end of the story if other discoveries weren't unearthed. Experts estimate that it would have taken anywhere from 2 to 3 months for the Sarah Joe to drift from the Hawaiian Islands all the way over to Sibylla Island. Although it's possible for people to survive that long on the open seas, it's extremely difficult, and even tougher if there are more mouths to feed and water. What makes this case more mysterious than it otherwise might be is the fact that there were a few surveys conducted by the US government and some photographs taken of the Tonga Atoll and the Marshall Islands between the 1979 disappearance of the Sarah Joe and its 1988 discovery. If the boat was there on Sibylla Island, it should have been found during these expeditions and surveys. Some sources state that there was a survey conducted in 1985, but I could only verify 2 surveys conducted in 1986. Neither of the surveys mention any boats or shipwrecks anywhere in any of the documents, which are otherwise quite detailed and precise. It doesn't seem likely that there would be no mention of any found wreckage, although, as I'll always admit, it's possible. So, if the Sarah Joe wasn't in the Marshall Islands from 1979 through 1986, where was it? Was it adrift for over half a decade? And if it was, how long did Mormon manage to survive on the boat? What happened to the other crewmen? How long did they manage to survive? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know the answers to these questions. At this point, I'm moving away from the facts and background and delving into some of my opinions on this case. Ultimately, I think the fishermen got unlucky and got caught in a huge storm that no one saw coming. The weather reportedly went from like a lake to a churning maelstrom very quickly, making it impossible for the small Sarah Joe to make it back to shore. If their equipment failed, as some have suggested, they wouldn't have been able to radio for help in time. If their motor went out, they would have had no way to power through the rough waves. Caught in the gale force winds, they would have been pushed wherever the tide and winds wanted them to go. It's possible that one or more of the men were tossed overboard, or even tried to swim for the shore when they realized that the boat was dead in the water. The Hawaiian Islands are beautiful, but the ocean is often treacherous, especially when the winds start howling and the waves start pumping. Even experienced mariners and fishermen can get caught in a sudden storm. It's happened to thousands of boats before. There are even some surfing spots in Hawaii, like the famous and aptly named Jaws, that don't break unless the waves are 60 feet or more. To put that in perspective, the next time you're in a city, look up at a 6-story building. That's how big the swell needs to be for Jaws to break. The next obvious question is, how long did the men survive? If they survived at all. If you're ever in a survival situation, remember the rule of threes. You can survive 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. Of course, these are rough numbers, and there have been cases of people going for longer than these suggestions, but it's a good rule of thumb to be aware of if you ever find yourself in trouble. With the rule of threes in mind, let's again consider the Sarah Joe. If the men on the Sarah Joe managed to survive the initial storm and didn't get thrown overboard and drown, they'd still have to find ways to get food and water for months at sea. Even taking the fastest estimate of time it would take to reach the Tonga Atoll, 2 months, that's still a lot of food and water that would need to be procured for even one man, let alone 5. In addition to the lack of food and water, the men would be beaten down by the hot sun day in and day out with no respite. Heat sickness and heat stroke can be fatal, especially for people already weakened by thirst and hunger. To me, it seems unlikely that anyone could have survived for much longer than a month or 2 on the Sarah Joe, although it is possible and people have survived longer in the past. At the very least, Mormon was able to stay on the boat despite the storm, and it's unclear how long he was able to survive on board. The medical examiner could not rule a cause of death for Mormon, making it difficult to determine just how long he'd survived. Since Mormon was the only body found, it's likely that he outlasted all of the others, perhaps subsisting on what he could catch from the sea. However, even if the storm hadn't thrown all of the fishing gear overboard, it would have been very difficult to survive just on what he managed to catch. People think of the oceans as teeming with life everywhere, but the truth of the matter is that there are vast pelagic zones where little to nothing lives, sort of like deserts on land. Every once in a while, there might be an oasis, a bait ball of small fish attracting predators from miles around, but those would be few and far between. Catching enough food on the open ocean with limited gear and supplies would be nearly impossible. Even if we acknowledge that all of the men likely succumbed to dehydration, starvation, or the elements, that doesn't explain the fact that the Sarah Joe was missing for over a decade. If the Sarah Joe only took the minimum estimated 2 months of time to drift across the sea to the Marshall Islands, it probably would have been discovered sooner, either by researchers or fishermen who visited the islands. At the very least, it should have been found during one of the 2 government surveys carried out in 1986. Again, it's possible that the researchers missed the Sarah Joe, but it seems very unlikely. From what I can gather during my research and looking over the evidence presented, the only answer seems to be that the Sarah Joe, after being damaged or disabled during the storm, ended up adrift for not only months, but years. I can't say for sure how long the crewmen were alive, but it's clear that Mormon managed to survive for at least a while before succumbing to the elements, dehydration, or starvation. The biggest tragedy about this story, in my opinion, is the fact that so many families and loved ones will never know the truth about what happened after the Sarah Joe was caught in that sudden storm. They don't have bodies to bury, with the exception of Mormon, and they likely never will. I can only hope that the loved ones someday find peace, despite the fact that there are still so few answers. That brings us to the end of our story for today. It's a sad but interesting cautionary tale. Even experienced mariners can get caught up in an unanticipated storm. How long do you think Scott Mormon survived? Do you think that the other men aboard the Sarah Joe survived the storm? And if so, for how long? And where was the Sarah Joe from 1979 through 1986? Thanks for listening and or watching. I greatly appreciate your support and engagement. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing for more cold or unsolved case content. And as a reminder, you can view all of my articles and videos on my website, coldcaseexplorations.com.